Welcome to the second installment of the Fik3505 course Wireless Multiple Access Protocols. In this section we will cover multiple access modeling fundamentals and conflict-free access schemes. The textbook parts we'll use in this seminar is the chapters 1 and 2 of the Raman City book. And as background material, we'll also use Queuing Systems, Volume 1, Chapter 5 by Leonard Kleinrock. The basic model for a message-oriented multiple access system that we'll use throughout the lecture is the one that we introduced in the previous seminar. On the left-hand side in the graph we see a number of sources S0 to Sm-1 that generate messages that are forwarded to the transmitters TX0, TX1, TX2 and TXm-1. These transmitters can store several messages waiting for transmission over the wireless system. The transmitters will decide when and how to transmit the messages over the wireless system to reach the receiver on the right-hand side. The receiver will be able to inform the transmitters through the feedback channel Z on the success of their transmissions. The problem is that the wireless system has a limited capacity. It can only forward a limited number of messages per time unit, and we will, without loss of generality, assume that the wireless system can forward one message per duration of a message. There's only one message at a time. We call this a message duration slot in the following. In order to provide a mathematical tractable model for the system in the previous picture, we need to introduce some notation and to make some additional model assumptions. First we will introduce the message duration. This is the time it takes to transmit the message. We will, without loss of generality, assume that the data rate in the system is constant. And we will later also normalize all time units to this message duration, and so the duration of a slot will be 1 in this normalized time. Next we look at the arrival rate, lambda. We will both look at the individual arrival rate from each source that will be denoted by lambda index I. But lambda without index means the total arrival rate of messages to the system. In a stable system, that is a system where messages do not accumulate in the buffers of the transmitters, the rate of departure at the receiver will be the same as the rate of arrival. So we'll sometimes also denote lambda, the departure rate or the throughput of the system, and that will be measured in message per time units. And if we use a normalized time, this will be messages per slot. The key performance measure is the delay. That is the time difference between the time of departure, or when the message is leaving the system, and its time of arrival. This delay will vary over time. It will vary over packets, and so we will model this as a random variable denoted d tilde. This random variable has statistical properties. The most important property we will look at will be the expected delay, or the expectation of the random variable d tilde, denoted d without the tilde. And sometimes we will explicitly normalize this to the slot time, and call this d hat. Which is then the delay per time slot. In most of the examples we use the normalized time, so t will be equal to 1. And finally, the parameter that we are, or the objective function that we are interested in, is the relationship between the delay and the arrival rate, or the delay and the throughput of the system. To focus a little bit more on the delay, we have a time axis here, and we can see the arrival instant of message I. We can see the arrival message I plus 1 and the arrival of message I plus 2 and so on. Eventually, at some point, message A will be transmitted, and that will take a duration t. And then we arrive at the departure time when the message is completely transmitted and successfully received, which is TID. And the difference between TID and TAI we call D tilde I, which is the message delay for message number I. And we are interested in finding out whether this sequence of D tilde I plus 1 and so on is a stationary process, meaning that the limit, in the sense that there is a variable D tilde that can be seen as the limit of di when I goes to infinity, meaning that the statistical properties of D tilde will be independent of I, or independent of the time when the packet is transmitted. Looking at our objective function, it will look basically like in the graph. This is the relationship between the message delay and the message arrival rate, or the message throughput, on the x-axis, and the behavior will be something like the one in the graph. We'll have a monotonous increasing function of the arrival rate. The higher the arrival rate, the more congestions, the more will packets have to queue up and wait for transmission, as the channel has a limited capacity. And there will also be an asymptote here indicated lambda star, and lambda star will be defined as the maximum throughput, or the maximum arrival rate for which the system will have a finite delay, for which D will be the packet delay for the messages will be a stationary process, and the expectation E of D tilde will exist. As a simple example of a wireless access channel for multiple access, we will use the TDMA example we used in the previous lecture. And a TDMA wireless channel means that all the bandwidth, all the transmission rate of the channel will be available to one message at a time. So we organize the transmissions into time slots, as in the example here, numbered 1 to 8. And so the problem becomes, how can we, in a distributed manner, with limited cooperation between the transmitters, how can we assign messages and transmitters to the time slots? And there are basically two ways. We can do an a priori or fixed assignment of slots, so that we give every transmitter a slot, and then we have a repetitive cyclic procedure to assign slots to transmitters. And the number of slots per time unit we allocate will depend on the average demand that or average number of packets that the transmitter has per time unit. The other strategy is since we don't know the exact amount of packets residing in every transmitter, or what the actual demand for transmission is, we may find out, try to find out and use the channel itself to find out what is the actual demand, and then we assign slots accordingly. And as a reference or hypothetical scheme, we will use the perfect scheduling scheme. This is a hypothetical scheme where we assume that the actual demand, the actual number of messages in every transmitter is known to the transmitter, so that they can organize their transmissions perfectly without loss. Taking a closer look at the dynamic assignment strategies in the notation of ROM and CD, these can be categorized in two categories, and they are denoted the conflict-free schemes or reservation schemes. In this case, parts of the channel resources are dedicated for reservation or for finding out what is the actual demand in the various transmitters. And the after we have found out which is the current demand, we then perfectly schedule the data transmission without any contention, without any collisions. This type of strategy, of course, wastes some of the resources to find out the demand, but on the other hand, the data transmissions then, on the other hand, become perfect. So it is obvious that we have very long messages, and if the contention period or the channel reservation period becomes very small, this can be a very effective way of providing multiple access. If, on the other hand, the messages are short and the other type of dynamic assignment strategies becomes more favorable, and that is what we call the contention or random TDMA schemes. And in these schemes, we simply transmit the messages on the channel and use the feedback information from the receiver to determine whether the transmissions were successful or not. And if the transmissions are not successful, we have to retransmit them in a certain according to a certain procedure. This is obvious that if we have low lambdas or low traffic, then the wireless channel will be mostly idle, and we can transmit without taking any consideration of the other transmitters, and most of the time our transmissions will be successful. As the traffic intensity increases, the risk of collision will be higher and higher, and at high data rates, at high arrival rates, the system will be filled with the collisions and not be very effective. This picture summarizes the various protocol classes as described by ROM and CD. We see the two main groups, the contention-based schemes and the conflict-free schemes on the left and the right-hand side respectively. And the contention schemes can then be subdivided, as we will see, into dynamic resolution and static resolution schemes. And this is depending on how a collision that occurs will be handled. Static resolution, for instance, could be, for instance, that when there's a collision, the various transmitters transmit in order to their ID or number, whereas a dynamic resolution may use probabilistic methods to resolve collisions. On the right-hand side, we have the conflict-free schemes. The left branch of the tree, dynamic allocation, is exactly the reservation schemes we discussed in the previous slide. And on the right-hand side, we do the static allocation, which are basically the TDMA and related fixed assignment schemes. And here are the answers to quiz 1. Reservation protocols are not suitable for systems with short messages. When the time spent on finding out what is the demand is much longer than the actual message size, then these protocols will become very inefficient. Contention-based protocols employ direct transmission without price signaling. That is correct. Contention-based protocols are not suitable for systems with long round-trip delays. If the feedback takes very long time to come back, it is systems become very inefficient, since we have to wait for the feedback to come. In that case, fixed assignment or reservation protocols become much more efficient. And reservation protocols do not necessarily have higher delay than contention protocols. If contention protocols perform very badly in the high load situation, and it could be much more efficient to use a reservation protocol or a conflict-free protocol. The model we have described so far is a very simplistic model, and this is the one that we mainly use for our mathematical analysis in the next few lectures. There are, of course, additional issues that we will look at throughout the course, and one of them is related to the connectivity or topology of the network. The model we described so far implicates system configuration similar to a cellular system where many transmitters transmit to a single base station. But without loss of generality, we can also see that we can model point-to-point system, point-to-multipoint, or even multi-hop mesh network type connectivity models. The channel properties are in our model very simplistic. We will assume that if a message is transmitted, it's either successfully received or it is collided, or two messages are transmitted in the same slot and they will be collided and all messages will be lost. But in practice, in a real wireless system, we could see that, as we saw on the previous lecture, messages can be lost due to noise and noise errors, even though there's no collision. And we will also see later in the course that messages can actually sometimes be transmitted simultaneously, and one or several of the messages that are colliding could actually be retrieved by the receiver. The feedback and acknowledgement can be handled in various ways. We could have a positive acknowledgement, a negative acknowledgement scheme. We could also use the absence of an acknowledgement as a negative acknowledgement in the feedback channel C. Synchronism is in practice an important issue. In our simplistic model, we will assume that the transmitters and receivers are synchronized and all transmissions start at the same time in a slot, so they are perfectly synchronized. But in practice, due to the path delays between the transmitters and receivers, perfect synchronization is not always possible. And particularly when we look at carrier sense multiple access systems, the path delays will be of crucial importance. Message properties can vary. We already discussed message sizes and the generation model. When nothing else is stated, we assume that messages are generated according to a memoryless Poisson model, not because that model is extremely realistic for data traffic, but it's easy to analyze and to model. In practice, of course, there are very many different data streams that have a very high correlation between successive messages and do not have the memoryless property that makes them easy to analyze. But we will, for the sake of simplicity, we will start our analysis with a Poisson generation model. User population, they could be small user population, large and infinite. The systems with large and infinite user population tend to be simplest to analyze, so that's why we focus initially on them. And the buffering capabilities of the transmitters may vary. We can think of systems with infinite buffers where packets are never lost, or we can think of transmitters with limited buffer size, meaning that messages can actually be lost when they arrive at a transmitter with a full buffer. So packets in that case can be dropped, so-called lossy message transmission system. The simplest of all contention-free multiple access system is the fixed assignment frequency division multiple access system. Instead of, as in the TDMA system, we divide the time in time slots, we divide the frequency spectrum in m equal sized parallel channels. And this means that we assign every transmitter its own channel, and every transmitter can transmit at the same time independently of all the other transmitters. The consequence of this will be that as we have only 1/mth of the bandwidth available for every transmitter, the data rate in every subchannel will now be 1/mth of the original data rate in the TDMA channel, and consequently the transmission time for a message will be m times longer. So every transmitter has its own channel, but now it takes m times longer to transmit every message. And since all the transmitters are independent of each other, we can now model them as m independent queuing system, and the queuing systems will be of the MD1 character, since we have only one server. There's only one packet that can be transmitted at a time. We have Markovian or Poisson arrivals, and the service time is equal to the transmission time. That is deterministic, that is independent of all the other users, and that is m times t. In order to analyze the delay characteristics of a FDMA fixed assignment scheme, we will briefly recap how the analysis of the delay is done in a general MG1 queuing system, and we will follow the analysis by Kleinrock in his book Queuing Systems, Chapter 5. A general queuing system is characterized that is a queue, and there is a server, and customers arrive at different time instants in sequence to the queue, and the customer n will arrive at time Cn, and a little bit later the next customer n plus 1 will arrive at Cn plus 1. When customer n is reached the front of the line, he will go on to the server, and at this time instant he will arrive at the server, and he will start being served, and when his service is completed, he will leave the system. When he leaves the system, customer n plus 1 will be at the head of the line, and then he will move into the server. And after a while, customer n is also serviced, and he will leave the system. The time spent in the service is denoted by the random variable x n plus 1. This is the service time of customer n plus 1. Now, we make the observation that when customer n leaves the system, by qn we will denote the number of customer that customer n leaves behind in the queue. So qn is the number of queued customers, of course including customer n plus 1, but that is right now forwarded to the server. And when customer qn plus 1 leaves when customer n plus 1 leaves the system, he will leave qn plus 1 customers behind in the system. And if the queuing system is stable, then the queue sizes qn plus 1, qn plus 2, and so on has to form a stationary process, which means that the statistical properties of qn and qn plus 1 must be the same. And if we denote by nu n plus 1 as the number of customers that arrive during the service time of customer n plus 1, then we can form the following relationship, that the number of customers that customer n plus 1 leaves behind, qn plus 1, is the same number of customers Qn as the previous customer left behind minus 1, that since customer n left, plus the number of customers that arrived during the service time of customer n plus 1. And the queuing size, the observation we make is that the queuing size at the departure instant has the same distribution as any other instant in a Poisson process. That is due to the memoryless property of the arrival process. So if we look at the departure instance, the arrival instance of a customer, or any time in between, the statistical properties of the queue that we queue size that we observe at any of those times has the same statistical properties. We also have to take care of the case where Qn is equal to 0 when the customer n leaves an empty queue behind. In that case, the next customer n plus 1 will find an empty system, and the number of customer he leaves behind in the queue is exactly those that arrive during his service time. So the relationship becomes simple, the one in the red box in the left-hand corner. We can now formulate this problem as a Markov chain, a discrete time Markov chain, where the states will be the customers left behind by customer n at the departure instance. And we can describe it by state diagram as shown in the picture, and the alpha 0, alpha 1, and alpha n on the axis are the state transition probabilities. We can of course analyze this Markov chain now using our traditional techniques and derive the state occupancy probabilities, and then we can calculate the expectations of the delay and the queue size. But there's actually a simpler way using the equilibrium conditions and the conditions on stability in the in this Markov chain. We can simplify our relationships according to the following, and here we have introduced the function delta of Qn being a function that is 1 if Qn is larger than 0, and 0 if Qn is equal to 0. Now, taking the expectations on both sides, we get the following expression, and now using the equilibrium condition, saying that in the limit the expectation of if the queue is stationary, the expectation of Qn plus 1 must be equal to the expectation of Qn. So the first two terms cancel, and we can derive the expectation of delta of Q of n to be equal to the expected number of customers arriving during a service interval, and that we will denote as rho. This on the other hand doesn't tell us anything about the expected queue size, but the trick now is to, instead of looking at the expectations, we look at the expectation squared, and if we get the expression at the bottom, if we simplify these expressions, we can then eliminate the squares, and we get the following expression for the expected queue size, and at the bottom line we can express the expected queue size in terms of rho, and the expected of the square of x, which is the x was the service time, the random service time, and this we denote n bar, the expected number of customers in the system. And using the famous little result, we know that the number of customers in the system, the expectation there is equal to the expectation of this time spent in the system. This is what we call our delay times the arrival rate. So this gives us the expected delay. We can also continue to derive the distributions of the number of customers in the system and the distribution of the delay. And the trick used there is to use the transform techniques, and we compute first the z transform of the Q length. So capital Q of z will be the z transform of the Q length, expressed in v of z, which is the z transform of the number of customers arriving during a service interval. And the latter one we can compute in the following way, which becomes b star of lambda minus lambda z. B star is the Laplace transform of the service time distribution. And putting these two things together, we get an expression that relates the Q size to the distribution of the service time, B star, in the following way. This is also referred to as the PK or Polacek-Khinchin transform formula. So now we can use this expression to get to the delay. We make the following observation. We know that nu of n is the number of customers that arrive during the service time of customer n. And we have the expression for the z transform of v of z of this random variable is b star of lambda minus lambda z. In the same time, we can observe that the number of customers that customer n leaves behind, Qn, will be exactly those that arrive during the service or the system time of customer n. He has spent dn in the system between his arrival and when he exits the system, and Qn will be exactly those number of customers that have arrived behind him and are still in the queue when he leaves in the first come first serve system. So we can use exactly the same expression to relate Q of z to the Laplace transform of the delay d star, as shown in the expression. And simplifying these expressions, we get finally the delay version of the Polacek-Khinchin transform formula that gives us an expression for the Laplace transform of the delay, or the moment generating function of the delay as a function of the Laplace transform of the service time. And of course this expression now can be used to derive all the moments and all the distributions of delay that we want. This brings us to the second quiz. Which of the statements are correct regarding an MG1 system at equilibrium? Have a look at the different statements and pause the recording at this point and find out the correct answers. And when you're done, advance the video. The answers to quiz 2. The distribution of future arrivals is not dependent on the current queue length. The arrival process is memoryless, and future arrivals do not care what is the current length of the queue. The expected queue size that an arriving customer finds is larger than the expected queue size that the departing customer leaves behind by 1 unit. Seems like a compelling argument, since the departing customer will reduce the number of customers in the systems by 1, but as we saw from the equilibrium conditions, these numbers have to be equal if the system is going to be stable. The expected delay can be derived from the expected number of customers using the Little's results. That is correct. And the PK transform formula does not give a closed form expression. It gives a relationship between the Laplace transforms of the delay and the service time. But in general, this is not a closed form expression. It has to be evaluated numerically. Now applying these results to our frequency division multiple access fixed assignment scheme, we realized that in such a system the transmission time is deterministic. X is constant, and it will be m times the packet size divided by the transmission rate, so it will be m times t as previously noted. And we can see that the expected number of arrivals during a transmission time is simply lambda times the transmission time, lambda times mt, as seen here. So that will be our rho. And just plugging this in, we get a expected delay expression that looks like this. And on the right-hand side, you see it's m times t times this expression 1 plus rho divided by 2 times 1 minus rho. And we can clearly observe that as rho approaches 1, the expected delay goes to infinity. So rho has definitely to be less than 1. Looking at the a graph of this expression, it looks like this. You can see that as expected, if we have let's say like the blue curve, we have 100 customers, 100 transmitters transmitting at the same time. The expected delay will be 100 when the traffic intensity or the throughput is very low. Even though the system is empty, we have to wait 100 time slots, since we get only 1/100th of the channel. And as the number of users increases, we see that the delay goes up, since there are more users that will share the same resources. The asymptote is at throughput 1. Here we have the normalized throughput. S is lambda divided by t. So S equal to 1 corresponds to the case when there is 1 transmission per original transmission slot. So all the systems have the same asymptote, S equal to 1 on the right hand side. We may also compute the delay distribution using the Polacek-Kenshin transform formula, and we get an expression like the one below. So here we have a closed form expression of the Laplace transform of the delay. We can now also compute the delay for a TDMA system. The difference between the TDMA system and the FDMA system is not noticeable when the traffic density is high, as when all slots and all channels are used, they behave about the same. But there is a difference when the system is empty or almost empty. When the system is almost empty and a message arrives in an FDMA system transmitter, the transmitter can immediately start transmitting, but he has to since to do his low data rate, he has to spend m times the time of the TDMA system to transmit his message. In a TDMA system, the behavior is different. The user has to wait for his slot to appear, but then he can transmit the message at the full data rate of the channel. So when the system is empty, typically the user has to wait 1/2 of the frame length, and if all users have the same number of slots, then the frame length will be equal to the number of users. So he has to wait approximately half the frame, or m/2. So the delay for an almost empty system will be m/2 instead of m for a FDMA system. And we can do this calculation in detail, and we can see the graphs show exactly that. The asymptote of the TDMA system and the FDMA system are the same, but the difference is now that instead of having a delay of m for an almost empty system with traffic intensity close to 0, it will have delay m over 2. And we can show that the delay of the TDMA system will always be smaller than the delay in an FDMA system, although the differences will diminish as we get closer to the asymptote. So this brings us to quiz number 3. Which of the 4 statements are correct regarding an F or TDMA system? And as usually, pause the recording at this point and figure out the correct answers. And here are the correct answers. At lower arrival rates, the delay is proportional to the number of users. Yes, that is true for both F and TDMA systems. At higher arrival rates, close to the maximum throughput, delay is also proportional to the number of users. So the constant m stays in front of the delay expression. So it will be m times higher than a system with only one user. The maximum throughput is proportional to the number of users. No, that is not true. All the users have to share the same resources, so the maximum throughput will be constant independently of the number of users. And D, as the number of users increases for the same total arrival rate, delay will increase, not decrease. So let's finally look at some of the more advanced concepts in Raman City Chapter 2. And one of the concepts introduced is the generalized TDMA. If we have non-equal arrival rates from the different users, it may be of interest to allocate different number of slots in the frame to the different users. An example is shown here where the red user gets 3 slots in a frame, whereas the blue user gets 2 and the yellow user gets only 1 slot for every frame. What will determine the characteristics of such a system is for each individual user. They're still independent queues, but will determine delay for every user is, of course, the number of slots per frame that will determine the asymptote, the maximum throughput. But the delay will also depend on the pattern and how the slots are organized. As we can see in the diagram, what will determine the service time will be the not only the number of slots but also the gaps between the slots. And as you remember from the Pollaczyk-Khinchin mean value formula, that depends on the square expectation of the square of the service time. And so you can also see that the variance of the gaps between the slots will determine the delay. And we know that as we should have as low variance as possible, which means that the slots should be as evenly distributed as possible, that the gap between the slots should be as equal as possible. And that's of course a difficult combinatorial problem, in particular if you have a small frame size and a few users. And the example shows here that actually some differences can be achieved depending on what are the different gap intervals. So what are the different gap patterns that are used in the allocation of slots in this generalized TDMA scheme. So this finally brings us to the analysis of reservation protocols. This analysis tends to be rather simple. We divide the time slots in a reservation part and a data transmission part, and the data transmission part is characterized by perfect transmission. All the slots in that data transmission is used as long as there's any packet in any of the buffers of the transmitters that will be perfectly transmitted, and all slots will be used. So the only drawback we have is that we allocate some time for the reservation, and one way of doing this is allocating mini slots to one mini slot or to each user, and that's basically that in the reservation period you use a fixed TDMA, and in this slot a station will transmit the signal or a very short burst, just indicating that it has a packet to transmit. And then we allocate the data transmission phase to those stations that indicate that they have one packet to transmit. So we allocate the slots in the frame only to those stations. And the result will be that we achieve a delay that is basically the perfect scheduling, meaning that we have only one user, and we modify this expression by this term 1 plus MA. MA is the duration of the reservation mini slots. And if A can be kept very small, then and the minimum that A can be is determined by the propagation delay in the system. If A can be made very small, then the fraction MA is very small to the 1, and the efficiency will be very close to the perfect scheduling. In summary, we looked at basic multiple access models and performance measures. We defined the multiple access problem as in the mathematical terms, and our key performance measure, the delay, was put in a trade-off against the traffic rate or the throughput of the system. And we characterized the various access protocols according to contention and conflict-free access protocols. We then moved into the conflict-free access domain, and our main tool there was the embedded Markov chain analysis for the MG1 queuing system. And we found an analytical solution for delay for the expectation and distribution. And we studied some more advanced concepts like generalized TDMA and reservation schemes at the end. And this brings us to the end of lecture 2.